Geopolitics in South Asia is in a state of continuous churn, and it is two nuclear powered nations that have now dragged water into their decade old dispute. I'm talking about the dispute between India and Pakistan and how the Indus Water Treaty, that has long been termed as a treaty that has survived three wars between the two countries and has also been exemplified by multiple geopolitical commentators as one of the best examples of water sharing arrangements between the two countries at the global level, now stands in a jeopardy. And why? Because India has been keeping the Indus Water Treaty in a state of abeyance ever since the deadly Pahalgam terror attack that was orchestrated by Pakistani terrorists on Indian soil in the state of Kashmir. And to discuss the issue of the water sharing arrangement between the two countries and the history of the Indus Water Treaty itself, I have with me Dr. Dan Haynes, an associate professor in the History of Risk and Disaster Department of the UCL London. So thank you so much, Professor Dan, for joining us and sparing your time for this for discussion on a very crucial issue between the two countries and something that doesn't really resonate only in the two countries, but has evoked global interest as well. Since you have studied this topic in detail and you've also penned a book on this solely dedicated to the treaty, would want to really understand from you, how do you view the current scenario where India has now linked the treaty and the water sharing arrangement with the control on state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan?
Well, firstly, thanks very much for speaking to me, Shika. I'm very happy to talk to you and your viewers. The question you ask is a big one, and my answer is fundamentally that there was a definite shift in the nature of the water relationship between India and Pakistan last year. The catalyst, as you suggested, was the deteriorating security situation, the terrorist attack that Indian security forces attributed to Pakistan-based terrorists in Jammu and Kashmir. But it continued a trajectory that had been going on for rather longer. So we can look back to at least 2023, when the Indian government sent a note to Pakistan asserting that it wanted to renegotiate parts of the Indus Waters Treaty. But that in itself was only a later step in a very long set of tensions, which have really been crystallizing between India and Pakistan since the 1990s. So we can go right back to the signing of the Indus Treaty in 1960 to explain the context, and we can talk about what has happened subsequently.
So if you could just, help share perspective on this contention from India that the Indus Water Treaty was an unfair arrangement to begin with. Do you agree with this statement? And the whole case that India bases this argument on is that 80.52% of the water of the Indus River system is controlled by Pakistan through this arrangement, and only 19.48% of the water is controlled by India. So do you think this is an unfair arrangement at all?
So it's accurate that Pakistan acquired roughly 80% of the total water flows in the basin through the treaty, and India roughly the remaining 20%. Whether or not that's fair is a matter of perspective. And this is something that Indians and Pakistanis have been debating ever since partition in 1947, or rather since the beginning of the Indus Waters dispute in 1948. And it's worth noting that in 1960, when Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the Pakistani President Ayub Khan signed the Indus Treaty in Karachi, both men immediately faced criticism from their own countries that the treaty was unfair towards that country. So from the Indian point of view, the vast majority of the water flow, as you have said, remained flowing into Pakistan and was available for Pakistani use, with some caveats related to the Western rivers, which I'm sure we'll get onto. From the Pakistani perspective, all of that additional water was needed to reroute to projects which Pakistan had previously acquired on the eastern rivers. So when we talk about western and eastern rivers in the Indus Basin, the western rivers are the Indus main stem, the Jhelum and the Chenab. and the eastern rivers are the Ravi, Sutlej, and Beas. So
Yes.
they are distributed roughly northwest to southeast across the basin. So
Right.
a lot of Pakistan's most important irrigation activity was happening on the Sutlej in Pakistani Punjab. And so
Right.
Pakistan had to transfer water from the western rivers to the eastern rivers. So there are different legal doctrines in international law for who owns a river, effectively, who has the right to river water. India and Pakistan both invoked rival doctrines. So India's doctrine was effectively that whoever is upstream on a river has complete freedom to use that river as they wish. Pakistan's doctrine was what is often called prior appropriation, meaning that the person who first starts using water has a continued right to receive that water. These are
Right.
obviously incompatible principles.
Absolutely.
And as far as I know, there has not been a kind of clear settlement amongst international legal experts over whether one is more accurate than the other. So
Right.
effectively, the treaty was unfair to both sides. But I would say, as a historian, as opposed to I'm not a legal expert, but as a historian, I would say if both sides are unhappy with a compromise, it's probably a good compromise. Because
Okay.
if one side was happy, that probably means that they had won and the other side had lost.
Right. But I would really want to point out here that there was a very interesting arrangement that time where India had in fact had to pay 174 million rupees at that time to Pakistan towards the construction of replacement irrigation canals and infrastructure in Pakistan. So was that, does that not add to this whole argument that it was indeed an unfair arrangement towards India?
So that payment was part of the Indus Basin Development Plan, which was worth a total of, if I remember correctly, somewhere over 850 million US dollars in 1960 terms. I'm not completely sure what that would be worth in today's money. So the amount that India paid to Pakistan was a very small proportion of the total cost of what were called replacement and development works in Pakistan. Whether or not India should have paid it, I honestly don't have that information directly to hand. It's a rather long time since I wrote the book that you kindly mentioned in your introduction. So I can't remember quite what the Indian money went to. But that was the product of hard negotiations over 8 years. So at certain points, Pakistani negotiators were asking India to pay for the whole cost of replacement works
Right.
in Pakistan. So this was a tiny fraction of what Pakistan originally asked for.
Right. Okay. Professor Dan, I will also want to ask you here. Now, we're sitting in 2026, and not just climate change, but we've also witnessed that, there has been a huge change in the glacier system of the Indus, also. And at this moment, although we are discussing that the Pahalgam terror attack became a catalyst for the treaty being kept in abeyance by the Indian side, but it is clear that even before Pahalgam, India had been seeking modifications in the treaty. And like you yourself pointed out, that in January 2023, India had written to Pakistan invoking Clause 3 of the 12th chapter of the Indus Water Treaty, asking Pakistan to sit down and start looking at and discussing modifications within the treaty. What do you have to say? Do you think the treaty really needs to be modified in the current environmental scenario?
I think the treaty, if I were in charge, which I'm clearly not, but if I were advising the Indian and Pakistani governments, I would advise them to revise the treaty to definitely include provisions for water quality, which in the existing treaty or the treaty as it was were very weak. I would encourage them to seriously think about reducing the risk of floods and other hydrometeorological disasters, which are again, very weak provisions, and to really think about ecosystem health and the environment. The broader question of whether the treaty ought to be modified in terms of what it permits and doesn't permit on the rivers is much more challenging, and I think comes down to political judgment fundamentally. The treaty is pretty much unique. As far as I know, it's the only treaty of its kind in the world in that it attributed the whole flows of rivers geographically. So almost
Right.
all other international water treaties in the world apportion amounts of flow, say a percentage of the flow of a river, or sometimes the quantity of water, to each country. So if you take the Ganga Water Treaty, which India shares with Bangladesh,
Bangladesh.
that allocates proportions of the Ganga's flow to India and to Bangladesh. The Mekong Treaty in Southeast Asia does something quite similar, but with many more partners involved, so it's more complicated. What the Indus Treaty did was assign the whole flow of the western rivers of the basin, with caveats, to Pakistan, and the whole flow of the eastern rivers to India, with very, very minor caveats that we don't even need to talk about, really. The tension between India and Pakistan over the treaty, as it developed between the 1960s and the 2010s, was over how to interpret the provisions that allowed India to do certain things with the western rivers. The treaty gave India the right to develop what are called non-consumptive uses and limited agricultural uses on the western rivers. And what this mostly meant was hydropower projects that didn't involve big storage dams and small kind of agricultural uses in Jammu and Kashmir. That was not a major priority for the Indian government in 1960. Because at the time, both countries were thinking about water more as a resource for irrigation and agriculture and less as a resource for power generation. Now, although agriculture remains very important for northwest India and Pakistan especially, power is a huge question in both countries. Both countries have had success with hydropower projects in the past. So really feeding the growing economies, the growing populations. I say feeding, what I mean is powering, giving energy to those growing populations and economies is a huge priority. So what India and Pakistan want out of water has changed somewhat, not completely changed, but it's evolved over time. Climate change, which you also mentioned, and retreating glaciers is completely irrelevant to the treaty as it was framed, because it doesn't have anything to say about how much water is in each river. I mean, realistically, the negotiations between India and Pakistan, which the World Bank sponsored through the 1950s, talked extensively about the amount of water that Pakistan wanted for Project X and the amount of water that India wanted for Project Y. But the actual treaty text in the end was really focused on the geography of the rivers. So whether the glaciers melt and there's more water, or whether the monsoons fail and there's less water, the treaty doesn't have anything to say about that. So
if I may
I'm not saying climate change is irrelevant. Yes, go ahead.
If I may just interrupt you for 1 second here, just wanted to ask, can we say, Professor Dan here, that the Indus Water Treaty today as it stands is an outdated treaty?
No, I don't think so. It's a treaty that was signed, that was framed to endure. So it was intended to be a permanent fixture in India-Pakistan relations. There are many flaws with it, which policymakers, academics, activists in India and Pakistan have pointed out. And India, as you've mentioned, the Indian government has been asking the Pakistan government to renegotiate the treaty recently. There have been long-standing calls in Pakistan to renegotiate the treaty, obviously in ways that would benefit Pakistani water users more. So the treaty is far from perfect, and there are many, many criticisms. In fact, in my book, which I published about almost 10 years ago, I was quite critical of the treaty compared with most commentators at the time. The conversation has shifted, so I'd say I probably now am more likely to defend the treaty compared with most other commentators. But it was a deeply imperfect settlement, but it was a settlement. And to me, that was preferable to no settlement. Clearly, there is a huge challenge which climate change poses to both India and Pakistan. And in an ideal world, I would love to see the two countries really cooperating and collaborating to mitigate the impact of climate change, to adapt together. Politically, that is clearly very challenging in the current environment, the current political environment. So I wouldn't say the treaty is an outdated text per se, but I would say that if there was a real spirit of cooperation, India and Pakistan could probably come at a much better one. I don't know if that's what anybody in either political establishment is currently proposing.
Right. Also here, if I may just ask you, there's been a lot of discussion here in India, how Pakistan has been taking India's soft stand for granted on treaty. And now, it is being seen in India, especially that there has been an awakening within India to finally use water as a powerful weapon to put pressure on Pakistan to stop the spread of terrorism on its soil and pass it on to India. Do you think that this kind of a narrative is closer to truth, that India was somewhere down the line very soft when when it comes to the IWT, and it's not really touching the treaty at all over the years, despite several of terror attacks that India has suffered and hundreds have died, not only in Bombay, we've seen in the Mumbai terror attacks, we've seen in the Uri terror attack, we've seen in Pulwama. There have been countless number of attacks that India has suffered and lives have lost.
Well, the treaty was an international agreement. Whether or not the Indian government honoured it is a matter of their own political judgment. So it's not for me to say whether India has been soft or not. I would say that the logic of equating water rights with security concerns is, again, effectively a matter of political rhetoric and judgment. There are all sorts of ways that India could pressure Pakistan, and it has done through things like encouraging the grey listing of Pakistan under the FATF, which I struggle to remember the acronym for, Financial Action Task Force, which is about money laundering and counterterrorism priorities. So the direct link that some Indian commentators draw between the security situation and the water situation is, again, a matter of political judgment. So obviously in Pakistan, you would hear the reverse argument. Well, firstly, you would hear the Pakistani government statement that it does not sponsor terrorism in India. The Indian government, I'm sure, has stated that it does not support terrorist activity in Balochistan, which in Pakistan is widely attributed to Indian influence. I'm not an expert on the security situation, so I really can't comment on the truth of any of this.
Right.
What is really clear is that the status of the Indus Waters Treaty in Indian politics has really changed over the last 10 years or so, from becoming a point of principle which India could use to tell the world about its adherence to international agreements, even when they seem disadvantageous to India, which, by the way, is a fairly common element of Indian statecraft. So now I'm going to forget the details of this, but there was a case between India and Bangladesh over some jurisdiction in the Bay of Bengal, in which the Indian government accepted an international ruling in Bangladesh's favour. And this was a signal that India is a kind of law-abiding state that will honour international agreements and international jurisdictions. So that, for a long time, was the Indian argument about the Indus Waters Treaty, effectively that the treaty had benefited Pakistan. And this is effectively what Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, said at the time, that the treaty benefited Pakistan, but India was doing it because that was, according to his principles, the kind of correct moral path for India to take. The current Indian government has a totally different approach to international affairs. Well, I think the difference between the Nehru era and the present era in international relations can be overstated, but certainly the rhetoric has changed a great deal.
Right. Professor Dan, I'll also want to ask you here. Another major contention between the two countries has been the storage capacities of water. And India has been repeatedly pointing out that it is Pakistan's own doing that it has been unable to create enough water storage facilities within its territory. And now it ends up blaming India for, causing floods in the country and withholding water and, damaging the country's agriculture by these measures. But India has categorically rejected these allegations, stating that these are not just overstatements, but these are lies. And in fact, the Indian government has pointed out that the Pakistani government has repeatedly failed to put their own act together and create enough water storage facilities, despite the fact that they are getting a major share of the water. That is almost 80% of the water.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. It's a very good question. Constructing new storage within Pakistan is domestically challenging from the point of view of domestic politics. There are serious rivalries amongst Pakistani provinces over water use, much as we have seen between Punjab and Haryana or between some of the southern states in India. So interprovincial or interstate water sharing is always very difficult. And
Right.
so some of those political issues helped prevent things like the planned Kalabagh Dam from going forwards due to effectively downstream concerns within Pakistan. So concerns in Sindh and other downstream provinces in relation to Pakistani Punjab. Storage storage has negative effects as well as positive ones. So there are good arguments that the terrible floods which have taken place in Pakistan several times in the last decade and a half have been at least partly attributable to what geographers call the over-engineering of the river system. So a river naturally will meander a little bit. Sometimes it will be high, sometimes it will be low. Rivers normally
Right.
have large floodplains around them. So since the British period, it was really British colonialists who started this, but there have been efforts in India and Pakistan to increasingly channelize and engineer the rivers,
Hmm.
which can, in good times, mean that you can control and manipulate water flows, but in bad times, it completely takes away the river's natural capacity to absorb high floods. And the famous Indian geographer Rohan D'Souza wrote a famous article, well, famous among academics who focus on environment and water, in the mid 2000s, arguing that in post-colonial countries like India and Pakistan, there'd been no serious attempt to get beyond this colonial idea of massively over-engineering rivers.
Right. Right.
So constructing more storage in Pakistan wouldn't necessarily benefit the country. There's a big debate. But parking that, I think it's worth noting that amongst Pakistani, particularly environmental activists and academics, there have been very long-running critiques of Pakistani water management for inefficiency, for its environmental harms, for the inequitable apportionment of water between provinces or within provinces. So none of this is new in terms of the Pakistani debate over water. And I'm sure there are similar debates within India about whether a project is beneficial or not. There have been major anti-dam protest movements in parts of India due to the effects
Hmm.
of some dams on some communities. I would say it's worth distinguishing some of this from the international relationship,
Hmm.
because what one country does with the resources within its borders doesn't necessarily have an impact on how it relates to others. It is complicated with water, and I won't bore you with details on the negotiations in the 1950s. Clearly, there was some
Right.
overlap. But one final point I would make is there's a common misconception
Hmm.
which has been going since at least the 1930s in South Asia that water which flows to the sea is wasted. This is completely
Yeah.
untrue because um, downstream ecosystems evolved to use these water flows. So
Hmm.
specifically taking the example of the Indus Basin, the Indus Delta region, which is now in Sindh, in the southern province of Pakistan, 200 years ago, was rich. It was thriving. It had handicrafts. Like many parts of South Asia under British colonial occupation, it suffered very badly in various
Yeah.
ways. So over the last, if I remember this correctly, since 1800, the delta has shrunk by well over 90%, I think, if I remember my figures correctly. So it was, obviously, this started under the British. The canal projects, which India and Pakistan both use now, did a lot to abstract water, take it out of the system. It wasn't flowing downstream. There used to be mangrove forests down in the delta. Those are now gone. And what we've really seen in the last few decades is, and we don't have good figures for this, but according to most estimates, at least several 100,000 people have had to migrate out of the Indus Delta into usually insecure living conditions in big cities like Karachi. And this
Right.
is very similar to what has happened in the Sundarbans in India, where coastal erosion and lack of water coming downstream and the loss of mangroves pose all kinds of threats. So
Right.
actually, from the point of view of the Indian and Pakistani governments, keeping deltas in good health is really important because otherwise they
Right.
will face serious economic and social problems dealing with people whose livelihoods have been destroyed, and they lose all the economic potential of the delta areas as well, which can be really important for fisheries because a lot of fish in the big rivers breed among the mangrove swamps in the deltas and then migrate upstream when they become adults. So there are all these effects and all these benefits to water flowing downstream. It's not wasted by any means.
Professor Dan, you mentioned in your previous answers that there has been over engineering on the river systems, and this is something that you said was dangerous for the environment and of course the river system altogether. Now this is something that I really want to touch upon. Why? Because India has now decided to start utilizing the waters of the Chenab River, happens to be one of the western river, and while there are two hydroelectric plants that are set to be commissioned, there are another four hydroelectric plants that are also under discussion within India, and India wants to go ahead with four more hydroelectric power plants. So that are going to be six hydroelectric power plants on the river Chenab, if and when they are their execution is done and when they become a reality. Plus, there is another hydroelectric plant that India wants to construct over the Jhelum River, also happens to be one of the western river. Now, I want to really, I want you to put this into perspective. Is this a similar kind of situation in Pakistan? Is Pakistan also resorting to over engineering of on the river systems? And do you think that this is? How do you think that this is going to affect the environment?
So Pakistan has some projects under construction at the moment, including the Diama Pasha Dam on the Indus main stem, hydropower projects at Dasu, and Mohman Dam on the Swat, which is a tributary of the Indus. So Pakistan also has various schemes in train. To my knowledge, it doesn't have anything like the number and scale of projects that India is proposing, for the simple reason that Pakistan already undertook a huge amount of construction on its side of the Indus Basin in the 1960s and 70s under the Indus Basin Development Plan, which provided for various of the big dams that Pakistan already has, like Mangla. I believe Tarabela also came under the development plan. So Pakistan has already done quite a lot of the engineering, whereas India, because of the restrictions of the treaty, has generally not been as aggressive on the western rivers. Obviously, we've seen on the eastern rivers, the Satluj in particular, a huge amount of development with the Pakranangal project. My mind slipped for a moment. The Pakranangal project, which was constructed in the 50s, a very, very large project on the Indian side. The
Biggest dam of
Indira
India,
Gandhi
actually.
Canal. Is it still? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Which also submerged most of what had been a princely state and caused all kinds of excitement for the Indian government in resettling the people of Bilaspur, as a side note. And then the Indira Gandhi Canal, which significantly increased the amount of irrigated agriculture in Rajasthan, or at least the amount under canal-based perennial irrigation. So I would say that some of the pace and scale of activity we're now seeing in Jammu and Kashmir, especially, but more generally on the western rivers in Indian-held territory, is really India trying to play catch up with what has happened elsewhere in the Indus Basin over the past several decades.
Right. Professor Dan, there has been a major discussion within India, and the Indian government has repeatedly pointed out that Pakistan has tried to obstruct each and every project that India has wanted to set up on the western rivers. And the biggest example for this is the long pending Tulbul navigation project, which is proposed to be as a lock-in control structure on the Jhelum River, one of the western rivers at the mouth of the Vular Lake in Jammu Kashmir, and it is intended to regulate the water flow there. And its primary aim is to maintain a minimum water level in the Jhelum River to ensure year-round inland navigation between Srinagar and Baramulla, which happen to be two areas in the Kashmir region of India. So, wanted to understand do you think that this statement really holds when India says that Pakistan has been trying to obstruct each and every project that India wants to initiate in its own territory on the Indus water, on the rivers of the Indus water system, simply because of geopolitics and its enmity towards India, and they really do not stand any environmental judgment?
I can't really comment on the environmental judgment question. From the point of view of the logic of the treaty and the politics of it, I think it's worth noting actually that there was a phase in the 1970s and 80s when the Permanent Indus Commission and the two governments were actually able to resolve various questions. So there were questions over how extensive India's irrigation schemes in Jammu and Kashmir could be. The Indus Commission solved that. There were some difficulties over the Salal project, which, if I remember correctly, the Indus commissioners couldn't settle between themselves, so it went up to the two governments. The foreign ministers of the two governments successfully settled that. So it's not quite accurate that Pakistan has always tried to block every Indian project. And actually, you mentioned how many Indian projects there are. It's only a few that Pakistan has raised objections to. If I remember correctly, it's 3 so far that Pakistan has requested neutral expert court of arbitration proceedings for. And the objections are always over to the specific design parameters of the Indian projects. I think my personal view is that it's natural for India to want to push the treaty text as far as it can to design what it regards as the ideal projects, or what Indian engineers recommend as effectively the best value for money that India can get and the best use of water from an Indian point of view. It's equally natural for the Pakistan side to try to restrict Indian activity as much as it can where it thinks the treaty gives it a basis, because both sides see water use as effectively a zero-sum game. So if India is using the water upstream, Pakistan doesn't get it downstream. So it's in Pakistan's interests to stop India from developing as much as possible, and it's in India's interests to develop as much as possible. But sorry, just to conclude that thought. So I think it's inevitable that Pakistan would seek to block projects that it thought it had good grounds for doing so.
Professor Dan, I would also want to ask you about the over engineering aspect once again. Since we've also already discussed the kind of projects that India has intended to commission and is already commissioned, and also you pointed out that Pakistan has also had several projects there. I'm sure you were aware of the floods that had marred the region last year, and it was a very, very bad situation. And not only, it started from Himachal Pradesh in India, which is actually the place where there are three of the rivers of the system that originate from Himachal Pradesh, from where floods had started. And if I just want to bring that here, because I did a study on the cause of the floods, and what I found out that there were 800 or so hydroelectric projects on the different rivers that originate out of Himachal Pradesh, which include Satluj and Beas. And it was because of these rampant hydroelectric power project proliferation over these rivers that the river was getting suffocated, and the river was not getting enough space to flow. That is what environmentalists in India pointed out. And it was that reason that there was a lot of methane generation within these power plants, and which was resulting in a lot of clouds getting trapped in the immediate environment and then resulting into cloud bursts. That resulted into massive flooding, and that not just flooded Himachal Pradesh, it then led to flooding in Punjab of India. And of course, the similar thing was witnessed in the Pakistani Punjab, and we saw hundreds of people lost their lives, their livelihood, their livestock due to the floods. And it was a very harrowing situation, frankly, for people of both the country, especially the region of Punjab of both the country. In that scenario, this over engineering aspect and this these hydroelectric plants that are being commissioned, what are they going to do to the environment?
So that's horrifying and fascinating in equal measure, I'd say. And I'd love to read your piece. Is it published already? or
Yeah,
is
yeah,
it
it is
forthcoming?
published. It is published. In fact, there
Okay,
are a lot of
I'd be very
other
grateful if you send me the link.
environmental, what do you call, publications that have touched on this aspect. How hydroelectric power plants have resulted into massive flooding of the area.
Yes, I wasn't aware of the specific argument about their effect on clouds and causing cloudbursts. Generally speaking, um, dams can have serious environmental impacts, and those tend to scale with the size of the project. Um, I don't think I can comment. I'm not enough of a technical expert. I'm not a climate scientist or a hydraulic engineer. So I don't have a lot to say beyond what you've already said, except that it's well established amongst environmentalist activists that dams can have really serious negative impacts.
Right. Would really want to ask you here, what kind of modifications do you think that both countries can sit together and discuss? And if they really want, I mean, if if you're thinking of in a utopian era, if India and Pakistan can sit together and discuss the Indus Water Treaty and its modifications, what would be the suggestions that you would want to share to the countries? What kind of an arrangement should they technically come around?
I would say the treaty is not the right place to start. I think transforming the agricultural economies of Northwest India and Pakistan is the most important thing that the two countries could do. The article on the India Abroad website, which again, I will have to rely on you to remind me the name of the author, makes lots of points about ways that Indian farmers have increased water efficiency, particularly in Punjab, Indian Punjab.
Mhm.
So if there were a way to help Pakistani farmers achieve the same efficiencies, I think that would be really, really helpful. It's important to remember that the agricultural system in the Indus Basin, particularly in Punjab, to an extent also in Sindh, and no doubt in other parts of the basin from India's point of view, like Haryana, were really based on a colonial model which wanted to maximize the amount of area that was under irrigation and maximize the amount of water that was being used because colonialists thought that there was basically infinite land and infinite water, and that all you needed to do was get the water onto the land and you'd have a booming economy. And they were somewhat right. It works in the short term, but in the longer term, firstly, it's very inefficient. So other countries in the world use water much more efficiently than certainly than Pakistan and I dare say than India through different kinds of techniques like drip irrigation, for example. And the other point is that uh, the the system of allowing lots of water to flood a field in order to moisten the soil to grow crops um, produces terrible waterlogging. So as early as the early 1960s, the Pakistan government commissioned an inquiry report using, I think, if I remember correctly, US experts into the waterlogging and salinity problem in Pakistan's portion of the Indus Basin, particularly in Sindh, which is downstream and so tends to receive drainage water, because they were already losing a substantial percentage of their agricultural land to waterlogging and salinity. As far back as the construction of the Sakar barrage in what is now southern Pakistan, on the Indus main stem in the 1920s, landowners were already complaining that just the construction of the barrage was increasing waterlogging and salinity. So it's not like people don't know this.
Yeah.
But the style of agriculture is economically inefficient, massively overuses water, degrades the land. We haven't even talked about the aquifer, the shared aquifer under the Indus Basin and groundwater pumping. This
Right.
is also a really serious environmental problem. These water resources are renewable, but they're not infinite. So
Right.
I think sharing best practice, technology, techniques, there are many commonalities between India and Pakistan. I mean, clearly two separate independent nation states, but in terms of culture and environment, there are many overlaps in the region. And so working together to really try and transform the agricultural economy wouldn't make the treaty irrelevant, but it would certainly reduce a lot of the tension and the need for that both governments perceive to have tension over water resources.
Right. You very rightly pointed out about the agricultural practices prevalent in both of the countries, and here in India, farm. laws have been a massive debate, and you would have seen that it was a very political issue here, because
Mm.
hundreds of farmers had resisted the farm laws here, and they subsequently had to be withdrawn because of the kind of controversial provisions they had. But there was one provision that really has resonated within the farming community as well, and there have been some right thinking farmers also who have resorted to organic agriculture, and looking at diversification of crops, of growing crops, that was a major problem in the Punjab region, especially here in India. Looking at what is happening in India, and also want you to compare it with Pakistan. India has at least started making those efforts, and there has been a great emphasis on diversification of crops. How much of it is resonating is a very different point of discussion, but there have been a section of farmers who have started embracing that change, to say the least. But I would really want you to compare it with Pakistan. Do you think that there is that awakening within the Pakistani regime or the government? Do they have that kind of an outlook? Because frankly, the Pakistani state and the way it has been undertaking its reform agendas has been very discouraging, the way they have gone forward with it.
Well, various policy documents in Pakistan, such as the National Adaptation Plan and a report on the water, agriculture, energy nexus, which I believe the Ministry of Forest, Environment and Climate Change published 3 or 4 years ago, said the right things effectively about improving efficiency, protecting the environment, transforming the agricultural economy. Actually implementing those things is very challenging. And it's worth bearing in mind that in Pakistan, much as in India, where there isn't an exact equivalent between the reserve list and the concurrent list, but the provinces in Pakistan have a lot of autonomy in matters relating to irrigation and agriculture, except
Right.
where it implies transboundary watercourses. So again, returns me to my previous answer. I think any mechanisms to share best practice, perhaps between states and provinces, between India and Pakistan, or at community level, between farmers, I think all of these could be really valuable, because clearly there is good stuff happening, at least on the Indian side of the border. I know anecdotally from speaking to contacts that there are forward-thinking farmers in Pakistan who are experimenting with different agricultural techniques. I couldn't give you figures or statistics for how successful any of this has been, but the problems are very similar on both sides of the border, and the solutions are likely to also be similar.
Right. My final question to you, Dr. Dan, would be not a question, but a request for you to sum it up for our viewers. What is the best way forward for India and Pakistan to ensure that there is a win-win situation of sorts for both the countries? And of course, it would be living in a utopian world, thinking that both countries might sit down and actually discuss a plethora of issues that exist between the two countries, but only for the Indus Water Treaty. What would be your suggestion to the two countries? What is the way forward? Is modification right approach towards the Indus Water Treaty? And if modification is the only path, what are the elements that modification should consist?
I've spoken a lot about what might happen in an ideal world, but I'm not completely naive, so I'll give an answer as to what I think could be the most realistic good outcome. I think if the Indian and Pakistani governments could nominate serious negotiators with a brief to actually work towards a joint settlement that would resolve some of the questions about, firstly, dispute resolution. We didn't really touch on this, but one of the big sources of Indian frustration with the treaty was not just about the allocation of water resources, but also about what to me as an outsider seems like quite a confusing situation in terms of the dispute resolution mechanisms, with two processes that can run in parallel. Resolving that question would be a really good step. Trying to define the extent to which new dam technology can and should be permissible under the treaty would also be valuable. I know a lot of the Indian argument, particularly about the Buglihar project, and what the neutral expert Raymond Laffitte actually found in his 2006 finding on Buglihar was that India should be allowed to take advantage of developing techniques that had come in since the 1950s when the treaty was defined. So finding a mutually acceptable solution to that question would be really valuable. And then what I mentioned earlier about really thinking about environmental protection and disaster risk reduction, I think is a completely necessary feature of the present day world, which I think both governments would be well advised to take into consideration. None of this would be easy. All of this is extremely difficult. The original treaty had a more limited scope. It took 8 years. It took hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to make it work. But if I'm going to the limits of what I'd say is my realistic optimism, as opposed to my idealism, that's what I would advise.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Dan. I think the biggest takeaway from this interview and from your statement is that India and Pakistan not only need to look at the Indus water treaty, but the agricultural practices and sort of undertake a holistic approach towards the agriculture and the environment perspective of the waters and the water sharing arrangement between the two countries. Thank you so much for sparing your time. It was indeed a very, very in-depth in a conversation with you, and we also got you got a color of the historical situation when the Indus Water Treaty was signed between the two countries, and you rightly put it into perspective the current scenario as well. So thank you so much for talking to India Abroad. Stay tuned and keep watching.